So welcome to everyone. Hello and welcome. This is the first panel in the Department of Women's, Genders, and Sexuality Studies 2019 Social Justice Speaker Series. Tonight's panel is Out of the Classroom and Into the Streets: Education and Activism's Relationship with and to one another. Thank you also to the event's co-sponsors, the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice, the Commonwealth Center for Humanities and Society, the Graduate Certificate in Diversity Literacy, the Departments of Pan-African Studies, Philosophy, Political Science, and Sociology, the Women's Center, and Pi Sigma Alpha. We're grateful to the work of WGST Chair Don Heineken, Administrative Specialist Jan Rayburn, and Brandon Harwood in the Commonwealth Center, who has made this the tech flawless in this event. Thank you so much, Brandon. Let me acknowledge my fabulous colleagues and co-organizers, Dr. Kyla Story and Dr. Ann Caldwell. I'm Kara Snyder, she, they, one of the series organizers and the newest member of our WGST department. Let me just say, I'm so excited to be here at the University of Louisville. I moved to this city 3 months ago. What a time to move. Just as the uprisings against anti-Black racism and state violence swelled, the world was watching Louisville. Recognizing this visibility, we conceived of an event that is both a celebration and a demand. We celebrate the vision and activism of our local leaders, in particular, the leadership of Black women and femmes, and we encourage more members of the U of L community to join in the uprising. We acknowledge the tragedy of Breonna Taylor's murder at the hands of the police and demand all eyes remain on Louisville as the struggle continues. As organizers, we wanted to do a series because the fight for justice for Breonna Taylor and for the Black, brown, and poor residents of our city is an ongoing struggle with multiple intersections. Over 4 panels in the fall, and hopefully more in the spring, we highlight the labor of you, the activists, the educators, the students, the artists involved. And we hope that the folks at U of L will join them in demanding racial and economic justice. So I'm gonna share my screen just to talk through the remaining 4 panels. So I encourage everyone to go to the WGST website and you will find the 4 panels in the series. So the first tonight, again, Out of the Classroom and Into the Streets. The next panel will take place on November 5th, again from 7 to 8:30. And here will be a dialoguing between arts and the relationship between art and activism. And you'll be able to see who our fabulous panelists are. The third panel in the series takes a transnational approach to justice. So it asks, how does what's happening in Louisville, how do we take a hemispheric approach to that? And then finally, we end with no justice, no peace. And here, we actually just got confirmed that Lanita Baker, who is one of the lawyers in Breonna Taylor's case, will be joining us, also a U of L alum, in addition to some fabulous folks. So I encourage everyone to look at the remaining panels in the series and to join us for any and all of them. All the events are virtual, free, and open to the public. Okay. So with no further ado, let me introduce tonight's moderator. We're so lucky to have him, and he will introduce the panelists. Jaison A. Gardner has been a social activist, health educator, and community organizer for more than 20 years. Since 2012, he has produced and hosted with our very own Dr. Kyla Story, Louisville Public Media's Strange Fruit, musings on politics, pop culture, and Black gay life, an award-winning weekly podcast focused on social justice and pop culture. Jaison is a co-founder and former member of Black Lives Matter Louisville and past board member of the Fairness Campaign, the Kentuckiana AIDS Alliance, and Sweet Evening Breeze Incorporated, Louisville's forthcoming LGBTQ homeless youth shelter. He is a founding pioneer of Kentucky's house ball scene, as featured in Modern Louisville's Magazine 2017 cover story, About Face, how Louisville's house ball scene has turned trials into triumphs. Jaison, thank you so much.
All right, and the crowd goes wild. Yay! Oh, stop, y'all. Thank you so much, Dr. Snyder. Hey, thank you for that wonderful introduction, making me blush. It's all, I'm so delighted to be here tonight, y'all. We have a phenomenal panel of beautiful Black folk who are going to talk to you all about activism and the academy and how those places meet and how they differ. And of course, this is a topic very close to my own heart. Um, I always felt like part of my role in the community, no matter what community I'm in or what part of what movement I'm part of, whether that's the house ball scene or whether that's during my time on campus or my time as an activist, and I always try to be a bridge between different communities. Because for far too long, when I was growing up, and I'm older than I look. No, but when I was coming up, there was this very kind of segmented idea around you're either an activist or you're an intellectual. You're a professor or you are a marcher, right? That you're a writer. That was a very segmented that you can only be one or the other. And the notion of someone being both an academic and an activist, or someone being both a student and a protester, or the fact that I remember when I first learned the term organic intellectual. This notion of someone who's not formally educated, someone who maybe has experiential knowledge, as Dr. Story often talks about, someone who knows about life from having lived it in a very improvisational way, like most Black people and queer folk and Southern folk, that their knowledge had just as much cachet and is just as valuable as those who have gone through formal education or those who are degreed or those kinds of things, and that no one person is better or worse off because of their formal training or lack thereof. And so that was a really kind of novel concept, at least around me coming up in the 80s and 90s. And so I'm really excited, especially to have such a distinguished folk from University of Louisville. Of course, I love the Department of Pan-African Studies, Department of Women's and Gender Studies, which have both been wonderful examples of folk who are professors who are also either figuratively or literally in the streets, either sometimes marching and protesting, but then also nurturing and teaching a whole different generation of protesters and folk like the professor here who's taking things like hip hop and bringing it to the classroom and taking, it was unheard of in the 90s that you would have a college class on hip hop, right? So we're gonna get into all that. Let me introduce you all to our panelists so you all know who they are. And I promise you they are wonderful. So we're gonna start with Dr. Ahmad Washington. Pronouns are he and him. Dr. Washington is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Human Development at U of L. He teaches in the School of Counseling. He teaches in the school counseling program where he works with pre-service school counseling students as they prepare to transition into the profession. Dr. Washington received his BS in psychology from Francis Mary University, his MA in clinical counseling from Webster University, and his PhD in counselor education and supervision from the University of Iowa in 2013. Dr. Washington's primary interest includes decolonizing approaches to counseling. Now, his most recent article, which uses a critical hip hop school framework to promote Black consciousness among Black boys, will be published in an upcoming issue of PSC. It's the Professional School Counseling, which is the premier journal in the field. So give it up a home for Dr. Washington. Yay! Excuse me, y'all got allergies going on. Next up is Remi Dior. Remi's pronouns are she and they. Remi is a U of L student and community activist. Remi focuses on creating digital and graphic pop art self-portraits to reflect her ever-changing modes of performance and presentation. Ms. Dior is a student in the PAS department with a concentration in Black feminist studies and critical trans theory. She's a country queen whose scholarship is informed by her experiences as a rural Black person. So give it up at home, y'all, for Remi Dior. Last but not least, Talesha Wilson. Her pronouns are she and her. Talesha is a U of L alum and community activist. She's a native of Louisville, where she's dedicated the last 10 years of her life to self-awareness, diversity and inclusion, and community engagement. Talesha strongly believes in connecting people through shared experiences. She's committed to educating all people with special attention to children and women and girls of color. Her mission is simple: self-awareness, love for oneself, and individual and collective empowerment. So give it up for Talesha Wilson at home. All right. So panelists, thank you all again for taking time tonight. Let's hop right into it. So I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Dr. Washington, how are activism and education interrelated? in your experience, or maybe they're not. But to what degree, for you personally and professionally, um, are they related? Please.
Yeah, for me, they've always been related. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina originally, and I tell people fondly that I'm from the place that sort of like helped the nation understand, like, if we can't maintain our peculiar institution, we're going to actually leave the union. So that's a core idea. That's fundamental to my approach to pedagogy. So I can never understand education as being separate or compartmentalized from activism. They're like synonymous for me. Unfortunately, that's not the case in the profession. It's not the case oftentimes in most colleges of education. Most of the students that I work with, graduate students or undergraduates, often see political activism or even political education as being somehow problematic, and that their role is somehow disconnected, and that they shouldn't be ideally espousing anything that sounds like political ideology and rhetoric in the classroom. So oftentimes there's a very, very real tension there, not just with students, but also colleagues who think in a similar fashion.
Remi, what are your thoughts? I mean, to what degree are education and activism related? And then also, as someone who is both a student and an activist, in what ways are they perhaps not related? Or do those kind of separations exist? As Dr. Washington mentioned, that some of his colleagues feel like it's inappropriate to mix the two. What are your thoughts from the student perspective?
I think I would agree with Dr. Washington that that dimension also exists. For me personally, as a rural person, as a first generation college student, like receiving like a formal education, kind of well, I mean, definitely influenced and invigorated like my activism, or my need to participate in imagining a different world for us. I was talking to a real good friend of mine maybe a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about like how do we get all this literature or all these things that we've read and learned from the classrooms, out into the community to folks who have not had the same privilege as us to, attend a formal institute. Um, and we were all caught up in like getting people to read. And I'm like, it's kind of ableist to tell people to read. Some people cannot physically do that. And then we were talking about like, why would we want to put people through the same bullshit that we have to go through in the academy to learn these things? So for me, like how activism and education like go together, it's, I've already, have walked through the fire of the academy as an undergrad. And I've already put up with the hazing and the gatekeeping that comes with, learning. And so how can I prevent other people from that harm? And so how can I translate what I've learned into a way that is openly accessible to my community?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. Talesha, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback off what Remi said and just, state that the reason why I created like diversity at the table in the first place was for that very exact reason. Taking the things that I learned through formal education and through privilege, because going to college is a privilege. So just taking that and giving it to people in my community in a way that is easy to understand and is accessible, right? But I think for people who believe to keep these things separate, I think that people need to understand that there are no um exemptions to white supremacy. It is everywhere and it's in every entity. So you can't exclude it from anywhere or any place or anybody. So even in these educational spaces, we still have to fight for justice. Even to be in the space, we have to fight for justice. So definitely, to even learn what you're fighting for, you definitely have to have that educational piece. Activism and intellect kind of go hand in hand with one another, not but also making sure that we are not being I don't know the word that I'm looking for, making sure that we're not excluding people in that language when it comes to education, because I think that activism is the educational piece. The actual what it is that I'm fighting for, why am I fighting, what are these different entities and institutions that I'm fighting against. That's, you have to learn it from somewhere, right? And I think that instead of pushing education onto people, just furthering your education altogether, not necessarily in an institution, but altogether, is a part of activism.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that leads me to my next question. Well, what do we mean when we say activism? What do we mean when we say education? Because education, in a traditional sense, is in somebody's school or college, right? Or just some kind of formalized class. But hey, we all know about a street education, right? Or the school of hard knocks, right? So what does education look like in non-traditional ways? Also, activism. I mean, there certainly is an argument that exists among activists, especially online about Twitter gangsters, right? So what does it mean to be an activist? Uh, like D-Ray, for example, who is someone whose primary activism takes place in the cyber world, right? And then you have folk whose primary activism is in the streets. And one group feels like, well, my message goes further and it's retweeted a million times. But this person feels like, well, I'm doing the hard work and the labor and I'm getting beat by the cops and tear gas. So is there more than one way to be an activist? Is there more than one way to be an educator or to be educated? What are we talking about here? Dr. Washington, why don't you start? What is education and activism? What are the different ways they manifest? Or are they a very narrow definition?
Well, for me, I'm always thinking about like how my first teachers were emphasizing the importance of critique, right, and criticism and understanding of relationships of power, and not necessarily just being able to appreciate my own identity as a Black person raised in the South, right? So I'm always thinking about like how fundamentally that happened outside of the classroom. And you mentioned hip hop earlier. So like some of the first models that I looked up to in terms of the connection between street philosophies, hip hop, and pedagogy were early hip hop artists. And that's not to romanticize hip hop, because that often happens in terms of it being sort of a quintessential way that folks who learn outside of the academy sort of refine and hone what it means to be an activist. But for me, that was foundational. So to Tala's point earlier, it's like, what are people doing to recognize the different institutions of power that exist, and helping people to devise and refine ways to not acquiesce to those systems? Not talking about providing a voice for people, like people inherently have their own voices, and being able to create spaces where those voices can be refined and directed where it needs to go.
Hop in, whoever else has thoughts. Remi, Talesha, you know, what are we talking? Remi, I'll ask you, what are we talking about here? I mean, you mentioned being a first generation person to go to college in your family, right? So surely to God, you know, we all know that you don't make you the smartest one in your family, right? That not somehow because you have access to a college don't make you the smartest, right? So what do we mean when we say education? What does it mean to be learning or to know about the world? Do those things count? Are they unofficial? What does it mean to be an activist, right? Some folk might say because you and Talesha are on campus, well, you all are privileged, and your activism doesn't count as much as somebody who is doing it in a different way. So what are your thoughts about the ways in which activism and education can be varied, or is there a very narrow definition?
Remi, you want to take that or me?
I guess I can go for a little bit. The question made me think of the first time that I saw Paris is Burning. And I just got, and you know, watching the film, I mean, it's just immaculate. And it's just, you know, I mean, we probably all have seen it like 1,000 times. But if you haven't, watch it. But watching the film, I think I was a sophomore in college, and it was noticing the way that the folks, you know, who were filmed in the documentary, like how they had such an astute knowledge of, you know, the intersections of race, gender, and class, so on and so forth, and how these systems of power interacted with them specifically. I mean, just really, I mean, it was just really amazing. And I was kind of mad. I was like, I had to come to college and pay like $20,000 to get a little bit of this. And it was just like, you know, some people, you know, depending on their, you know, life situations, unfortunately are able to learn those things throughout, fortunately and unfortunately able to learn those things in different ways. Thinking about education and activism and what education really really is. I think about my grandmother in particular, who stopped school at the ninth grade to take care of her family. She was a farm girl and she worked on the farm, and how she curated her own intellectualism about the world, being a Black woman in the rural South. And it goes back to what you said about Dr. Story and what she actually helped me realize in her Black Lesbian Lives class through writing a biomythography, was actually paying attention to how my people in particular and myself have read the world and have understood the world. So I think for me, learning that and then having a formal education, then having a professor like Dr. Story really allowed me to investigate myself and to be more proud and actually realize that I have an intellectualism that was innate inside me and did not come from U of L.
Right on, right on. That's a brilliant point. Talesha, I'll let you take it over.
Yeah, so I had wrote down a few things because everything was just coming to my head at once. But the first thing that made you said something about, well, you said activism and what is activism. And for me, it made me think about, just recently I had a training and we really dived into the differences between activism, protesting, organizing, and influencing, right? Um, we kind of talked about the differences between all of those things. And I think that activism is this very intentional seeking of information and of knowledge and of things in order to create some sort of change, no matter what that change is for or towards. Um, and it's also about like changing systems, changing access, changing conversations, and doing the research behind that. Or in research doesn't have to be anything formal, but doing that intentional research on how do we transform from this into that? How do we activate? Um, and then you asked about education. And for me, education is so subjective because it can be very broad or specific. For me, I think that education has a beginning, but it doesn't have an end, right? So it doesn't matter where you go or what you do, you're continuing to learn, you're continuing to be educated. Even if you're not seeking out that education, you are still being educated. It's an endless thing, it never stops. Of course, some people take it in other ways than others, but still, it never ends. Literally, right now in this very second, we are learning and we are being educated. And I think that that's not something that has to be attached to an institution or a piece of paper or a degree. Now, again, that's that privilege that goes into going into a college or a university. But I still think the seeking of education is the seeking of education and going to get that and knowing that it's endless is what makes it more broad and what makes it more accessible to everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. I wonder if you all have thoughts around, the three of you have thoughts around what universities can do to better support activists. I was really intrigued, Remi and Tyler, you all talking about like how do we take this information, and I really appreciate you all also pointing out like it ain't just about reading articles because some folks love to read. I love to read myself, but I also have my podcast. I'm a firm believer in multimedia and new media. That some people love to read the good old fashioned written word. Some people need to hear it. Some people need to see it on television. That's why I argue that visual media is one of the most powerful mediums. I mean, we think about Birth of a Nation, that film, right, that really kind of created a whole racist ideology. Well, of course, America was already racist, right? But they created this kind of racialized hysteria, and it was a damn, considered the first blockbuster movie, right? And then far more popular than any book ever will be, right? So people need to see things, people need to touch things, and so I'm a firm believer of how do we take these ideas and manifest them into ways that everybody has access to. And that's certainly the work that Dr. Story and I try to do through the podcast, by taking issues and making them dissectable and making them approachable. But you all have thoughts around ways that universities like Louisville, other institutions can do more to support activists. I mean, or what are some things that have been done well? For example, panels like this that are open to the public. But in my opinion, an obstacle would be, well, what if someone, I'll give you another example. So I've done a few of these panels around different institutions. Some use Zoom, some use Microsoft Teams, some use Skype, right? When it comes to Teams, if you're not part of a professional organization or institution, that's a platform you might not know as well as Zoom, right? So there are barriers in terms of having an account, sign up for an account. It's not just like you can come to your television or come to a lecture on campus, right? But so what are some examples of things that universities have done well to support activists, organic intellectualism, and what are some things that universities can do better, either individual departments like WGST or institutions as a whole? And while y'all thinking, yeah, go ahead, Tyler. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Well, you're on mute, love. Unmute yourself.
Oh, my bad. I think that so when I think about who supports activism at U of L, because that's my only experience, I only think about these specific departments, right? That literally have no choice but to, because it literally is embedded in it, right? So I think of Pan-African Studies. I think about women and gender studies. Activism is closely related to whatever it is that you're learning in either of those spaces. So I think that the departments do well specifically. I think that the university could do better in inviting, not even inviting, being more active in the community. So even if you go to even if you're from a different area and you go to U of L, you are still now a part of this Louisville community. So it still is very important for you to be aware of the things that's going on around this city. And I think that it would be really good for people who are on U of L's campus and who has the ability to make these changes on campus to go into the community, to, for one, have live bodies and live stories of people who you can create change to, whatever degree you're getting. And I think that that's the large disconnect, is that people are not making these close relations with each other, right? Instead, people are able to be in their own corner of U of L, which is a couple blocks. You know what I'm saying? It's this little square.
It's a little bit, yeah. And the grand thing, this little bit, yeah.
Right. You in that little square and you really believe that this is the only thing that exists. And you don't understand that with this little square comes so many privileges and networks and access to different things. So then when you go out into the rest of the world, Louisville, and you're trying to preach to them something that was taught to you on campus, you are coming at it with I have a degree, I have networks, I have mentors kind of mind, and that's not okay.
That's a brilliant point. All right, so by the way, listeners, I'm so glad to see all the participants. I see some familiar names and I see some new friends as well. We're so delighted to have y'all with us. If you all have questions for the panelists, you all can use either the chat function or the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that. I really want you all to be engaged. I'm used to doing these things in person. Pardon me. So I'm used to having folks, raise your hands, questions arise, but please, by all means, if you're sitting at home watching, put your questions in the chat function or the Q&A function. I've been seeing some signifying. They're like, yes, Paris is burning. So we appreciate that. We appreciate that engagement. Dr. Washington, I want to hear more about the ways in which you've been, you mentioned hip hop being an early example for you of activism. And so on the podcast, we had a professor who did a class on Beyonce, right? Or there's also stuff like Beyonce politics, Beyonce feminism, or Gaga feminism. And I mean, there have been classes on, there are classes on any number of things, but what are some of the specific ways in which you use hip hop to teach about when it comes to counseling? I mean, how are those things remotely related? In what ways are hip hop lyrics and hip hop culture and hip hop figures able to teach us ideas that relate to the tenets of your profession?
Right. So when I think about how I've come to understand counseling, I think about counseling as talk therapy between two adults in a very sort of like didactic formation. And maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but the demographics in counseling look a lot like the demographics of the teaching profession, dominated by middle-class white women, oftentimes who come from very insulated, culturally encapsulated communities. And there's this idea or this fascination with hip hop culture, but there's not an engagement with the folks who've historically created the culture itself, right? So I've had students talk about their infatuation and enthusiasm about hip hop culture, but a very, very palatable, unwillingness to engage with the social and political and cultural spheres, right, that were emerging at the time in the 1960s, right? So I want to be able to use the artist and the lyrics as narrative forms, ways of engaging students in scripting and crafting ideas about themselves and how they exist in the world. But even more important for me is understanding the social and political and cultural climate at the time that hip hop emerged, right? So thinking about the very volatile 1960s and what that meant and why the 1960s were so volatile, understanding reports like the Kerner Commission, that was a very, very widespread document that was exploring the two nations that existed, and that if this divisiveness wasn't rectified, that the country as we knew it would be in shambles. And here we are dealing with those same issues several decades later. And that's just one facet around how my engagement with the culture looks very different than how my students, who are overwhelmingly white, perceive the culture and don't really understand its educational viability and utility in the classroom. The other point that I would like to make about what can the University, U of L, do specifically, making the content more accessible. Like oftentimes these libraries have fees that make it practically impossible for you to access content if you aren't a student or a faculty member. And I see that giving open access so people could access and then disseminate that content wherever they see fit would be a large step in the right direction for the university.
Yeah. Professor, how easy of a sale is what you do to your colleagues or to the profession? I mean, it's like I'm curious, like, people like, you want to BS, like, how easy, tell me, like, listen, take it away. I want to hear, like, your colleagues, because I'm sure, Tyler mentioned that you have, like, activist traditions like gender studies or Black studies, but counseling is like one of the hard sciences, I guess. So, like, are your white colleagues like, oh yeah, Jay-Z, total intellectual, like, what's that process been like for you?
Well, I think so often it gets utilized as a way to reinforce ideas of educational meritocracy, right? But anything that sounds like a very poignant or incisive critique of capitalism is not at all embraced, right? So they're willing to talk about hip hop artists who are models for kids to emulate, who come from dispossessed and disadvantaged backgrounds, but it's still understood within the framework of capitalism and meritocracy and individual uplift, right? Which often run counter to the principles and ideas of the disciplines and departments that the other two panelists spoke to.
Remi, I want to come to you. You mentioned Paris is Burning, and much like yourself, that movie. Of course, I love that film. But you're right. The people in that film, who most of whom, or probably all of whom, were not formally educated, possessed such a wonderful analysis of the world in which they were living. Right. And the first you like, child, they're just poor, Black, gay, and transphobic. You like, but they really daggone brilliant. Right? And you can quote Dorian Corey or Pepper LaBeija, and those lessons still make sense some 40 years later. But I want to ask you, Remi, in particular, as you talk about ball culture and categories in the ballroom scene and the Black queer culture period, what are the ways in which Black, queer, and trans embodiment or performance is a form of activism and or education? If you go where I'm going with that, like, like, when we say things like get into it, right? You're telling people, get into what I'm giving you. Like, I'm giving you an education, right? I'm a bitch about to read you, right? Even our kind of sassy phrases have to do with something I'm about to do or show or tell you, even if you're coming from me, is to help you understand something. So how, in what ways are Black, queer, and trans embodiments and performances forms of activism and education in your experience or in your thinking, Remi? Thank you.
I think when you said that, the first person that came to mind was a person you and Doc had on the podcast, Fatima Jamal. And they were doing, I think at the time of the episode, they were doing some film work around desirability politics. And I think they had done maybe like a 5-minute preview of the film. If anybody wants to go watch it, I think they're still gathering funds if you guys want to go support them to finish the documentary. But what I really learned from them on Instagram actually was that they use their body, their physical form as a site of intelligence. And they talked about uh, how their body, how their body defined the world and how the society wanted to define the body and how their body interacted with all these societal systems. And it was through them, like having so much respect and so much reverence for their form as a Black trans person, as a Black trans feminine person that was currently transitioning, really inspired me to look more into how like my body has a certain intelligence and what does this form and what does me existing in the way that I do tell the world, and what does the world tell me because I exist like this. And so I think about, and I think about a lot of, my Black, trans feminine sisters who I follow on Instagram. Mojo Disco is another person that uses her physical form as a site of art and intelligence. And I think for us, our words, our vocabulary, but most importantly, like our form. And you were talking about categories, and we can go sometimes like down the whole list more categories. I'm not too familiar with the ball scene. I haven't really participated as much as I would like. But I think what that speaks to is, our community being able to name ourselves, right? We live in a world that is often going to call us and tell us who we aren't. Even, post-mortem, that's where it happens mostly. A lot of us will pass away and, folks will disremember us. They will dead name us. They will, do everything that we have told them not to do. So I think that using our voice and using our bodies, especially when in my artwork, I take pictures of my naked form and I do different, collages around them because you will see me the way I want to be seen. Right? I can walk outside and I can be called a man, or all kinds of derogatory, transgender terms. But on my Instagram and my Twitter, y'all are going to see me the way that I want to be seen. And you have no other choice. So when I think about, our vocabulary and our culture, I think about, I'm also a fan of new media. And I think about how social media in particular has given trans people and Black trans feminine folks in particular the agency to name ourselves in such a way that we have not been able to before.
I love it. I love it. Tyler, I want to ask you, your work centers around self-empowerment, self-awareness. As it relates to Black women, Black femmes, Black women, Black girls, what are the ways in which Black, the answer is probably obvious, but what are the ways in which Black women have been at the forefront of education and activism movements, both formally and informally? We know about formalized, we can all name like Black teachers or Black CEOs who are women, but what are some of the informal ways in which Black women in our communities and our families are educating the generations and being the ones at the forefront of creating change? Talesha, you're muted, baby girl. You're muted.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. I keep forgetting about this mute button. I think I just need to leave it off. But no, I think that my favorite way is the most organic for me is going to an elder's house, really sitting with them, talking with them, asking them about their experiences. And when I say about elder, I mean like older Black women who have went through things that maybe you haven't went through but could potentially go through. Them telling you about their experiences with relationships, their experiences with people in their family, that education on how they got through whatever obstacles they had. That kind of informal education is what I am closely connected to. And then I think about people in the activism community who are educating me. They are not my professors, but they are still educating me about things centered around Black liberation. I think of Chanel when I think of people like that. I think of Kalila when I think of people like that, who taught me about peace and about the green dot and things like that. So, and I think that many Black women specifically, they don't try to do it. You naturally want to take care of people, and some of taking care of people comes with being vulnerable, transparent about your experiences. And I think that even to like have education, you have to have real life experience. So like without the real life experience, we don't have nothing. We don't have no themes. We don't have nothing to support our theories without that actual experience. I have to test it out, or I have to have been through it. We didn't learn about sex or domestic violence just because it came about. There are themes that were created by these things happening over time and over time that we concluded something. So I take those things into consideration.
I love it. I love it. So we have a question from one of our participants. Hello, Treva Hodges. Thank you for that question. But Treva asks how we get more progressive. I guess we being the activists and the intellectuals or just the institutions. How do we get more progressive about bringing social justice, the issue of social justice, to the forefront in more rural communities where people are complacent and where formal education offers stops at high school. And I would say even beyond. So we say we have rural folk, but then also even urban folk, right? Who might consider to be apathetic, who have just kind of resigned themselves to either perhaps they're black folk or queer folk who've accepted systems of oppression and like this is just the way it is, right? Or you have white folk, poor white folk who are in the rural parts of the country, perhaps, who think these problems don't exist. But how do you take people who might be considered complacent or apathetic, who might be in rural communities or urban communities who are probably not formally educated? How do we help? In other words, how do we get more progressive about taking these ideas to them, not in a savior type way, which I know where I'm going with this, without turning folk off with academic jargon, training, elitism, saviorism, right? How do we do that? How do we help facilitate that is a better way I'm asking. Whoever has thoughts.
I have a thought on that. So I remember going to U of L and learning all these things about myself, and then like going to my family and trying to get them to understand things that for me now made sense. And it was literally the most difficult thing ever. And what I had to learn and what they told me over time is that like they were intimidated by the words that I was using, the mannerisms that I had, the audacity that I had to be saying certain things. Now I have been able to connect before investing, or that they need to connect with me before they invest in anything that I have to say. And I think that's what I try to do with diversity at the table. Instead of me just going to people and being like, you need to know what gender is, you need to know what sexuality is. I am now just going to do an activity that is centered around that, to where people don't even realize that they're learning something. But in the end, when we talk about it, people are like, oh, I think demonstration, a lot of times we try to talk to people, but people learn through experience. Sometimes you got to demonstrate things for people in order for them to understand. I'm not talking about just throwing somebody in the pool and saying, go swim, but I'm saying sometimes you have to jump in the pool yourself and say, this is how we do it, you know? So that's the way that I try to navigate those conversations in my communities, where I know that, listen, I have some knowledge that they may have not have had access to. So therefore, I am going to talk to them in a way that doesn't make them feel little or make them feel inferior to me. Also, making sure that I open up this space and encouraging them that, hey, there is something that I can learn from you as well. Um, I was, and this is it ain't off topic, but it's really related. But I was dating someone before, and something that they used to tell me is that they were intimidated by me and my friends because we kind of talked about all type of broad things. And what I ended up talking to that person about is telling them, like, you have something to offer to this conversation too. And even if it's not exactly what we are saying, that's okay. You still have something to offer. And sometimes that's a different perspective. It doesn't have to necessarily be the actual facts. It can be a different perspective.
It doesn't have to be in the same words. I mean, as someone who considers myself a linguist or someone who loves, and I love to use big $5 words, but and I have a younger brother, and of course, he's my younger brother, but he's bigger than me and taller than me, and he's, of course, I'm gay and soft, and he's like an athlete, and every time we get into an argument, we arguing, he ready to beat me up, right? Because he always tells me like I don't have the words you have, right? He's always upset with me because, and people can get intimidated by the words you use, so it's important to let people know that, look, we ain't got to speak, that's why I was really fascinated as a young person with the notion of Ebonics or Black English vernacular, like the notion of like, oh, so it's okay for me to talk about the same stuff with you, but use a different language. And then it's okay that I come in here and don't speak proper English. Now, again, I have appreciation for proper English and subject, verb, I love all those things, but I also recognize we got to create spaces that are decolonized, that allows people to not feel bad if they don't know the same phrases we know, the same words we know. Now, again, for those of us who are lucky enough to be in college, we have to know those things, right? Like Dr. Story be like, yeah, you can talk about experiential, but you got to talk about the theory. We can talk about what happened to you last night, but you got to read this chapter too. You know what I'm saying? And so you have to have both and to be well-rounded.
Yep.
Now, as we begin to wrap up, I just wonder if you all have some reflections on the current state of things, both locally and nationally. Certainly, we know what's going on here locally with over 100 days of local protests, which I'm certainly, I'm hella inspired. As someone who was on the early lines of BLM, many years, not many years ago, but I mean, there's been a couple at this point, and long before you have these numbers, I'm hella inspired, right? And I want you also have simultaneously things going on at the University of Louisville. That was the president was recently on the news talking about U of L's anti-racist approach. Do you all have thoughts about either what's happening in the city of Louisville and or U of L as it relates to activism, education, racial justice in particular? Some things that really make you proud to be from Louisville, U of L, some things you want us to do better, or just thoughts in general about what's going on, is your final thoughts. Remi, I'll start with you, please. Give us your final thoughts.
I think I'm really inspired and really like love filled by the communities that are being built and supported through the uprisings, and the amount of families and cousins that I do now have because of this. Final thoughts. I do have a final thought about the previous question about rural communities and how we can better, I don't know, get rural people more involved in activism. And I had the same experience as Tala. I went back to my family probably about a year after my freshman year, and I was like trying to teach them all these cool things that I've learned. And I was, I was being very pompous, being very, I had the fucking audacity, and they were like, really? And so I had to go back and I was like, I gotta rephrase something like this. And what I've noticed and what I've been able to observe about my hometown and rural communities in particular is the amount of policing that goes on within my community. And unfortunately, I think that before we could engage like folks where I'm from in this type of work, we'd have to address, state violence that goes on within rural towns. The amount of times I've noticed or, been made aware of my cousins, my Black male cousins, being, harassed repeatedly by police. And the problem with being in a small town is that they know your car, right? They know what car you drive and they know who you are. And if you've been caught on a different type of prior, that means that sets you up for harassment. And so when I'm thinking about, engaging my folks in activism or engaging them in, some of the things that I've learned, I have to think about that. I have to think about like most of the rural Black women that I'm around have one or two more jobs. They are being a mother to their actual born children and then to the neighborhood kids. And so I am kind of at a crossroads because I cannot fix all of these societal, these systemic problems within my town. But I think it is something that our allies in metropolitan areas and in other areas across the state should be aware of when we talk about engaging rural folks in activism.
And I just found out we got a little bit more time. So Dr. Washington, I'll let you give some final thoughts, and then we luckily had a couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to ask those as well.
Yeah, back to the previous question around sort of like rural apathy and folks who might be in the inner city who are just frustrated and exhausted by having to essentially choose between the lesser of two evils. I think it's important to distinguish the two, because when I hear rural, oftentimes, and I'm not suggesting at all this was the intent of the person posing the question, but rural is like, it's a word used to really capture white disenfranchisement. And oftentimes the appeals to, white populist voters is the idea that somehow the things that they're entitled to as fundamentally people who are settlers is that there are entitlements that they are losing because people who have been marked as othered and people who have been marked as undeserving are encroaching on things that they feel legitimately entitled to, right? I think that's important to recognize and to name, honestly, and distinguish between folks who are very, very astute, politically astute, and are willing to verbalize their frustration and exhaustion between two political parties who've used the plight of Black folks in this country as political pawns, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make. And in terms of being at U of L in this context of the desire to see it become the premier or one of the premier anti-racist institutions in the country, I just want to be able to use that language and center it, and for people to understand how almost impossible that is if you're talking about institutions that are land grab institutions, right? That literally sit on territories that are occupied territories. How can you pursue anti-racism and an idea of decolonization if you don't name the powers of coloniality, right? And how we are all in many ways complicit, that it's not just something that you can make, it's not just a phrase that you can plaster on a t-shirt, right? Decolonization is literally the erosion and deterioration of all of the apparatuses that sustain us, right? And how do you do that if you're an institution rooted in capitalism trying to attract a particular demographic to campus? Like, that's a very, very complicated endeavor.
Wonderful. But before we go to the questions and the question and answer, I have a very, very important question for all three of you all. Very serious question, so please be thoughtful about your answers. What are y'all gonna be for Halloween? Are you all dressed up for Halloween? What are you gonna be? I only ask that because I know that's my very serious question. Because I spent today at the costume store. Like Halloween is one of my absolute most favorite holidays, and so I spent all day at the Halloween store. And I'm gonna be a vampire. Just a quick icebreaker. Are you all gonna dress up? And if you're not, what would you be if you could dress up? Tyler, I know you have something in mind.
So I too, Halloween is my absolute favorite holiday. Love it so much. Love seeing all the kids in their different costumes. It's my favorite, and I just love it. It's so much fun. Anywho, I don't know what I'm gonna do this year. I think me and my friends are thinking of doing another group thing. I know we did Rugrats. We did Hey Arnold. We were playing along with the idea of Recess or Scooby-Doo. I wanted to do Grease because I just thought it would be super easy, but also very cute. So that's some of my ideas. I don't know, my friend Wes, one day I had on the outfit, my friend Wes said I like Kim Possible. They were joking on me, but I really did. Once I looked into the mirror, I had on my black boots and my olive pants and my long sleeve black shirt, and then my wig was the color of Kim Possible's hair. So I think that if I can find that wig and put that together, I might do that as an easy quickie, but still cute.
I love it. Of course, still cute. Remi, what are you doing for Halloween? You gonna dress up, or if you could, what would you be?
I unfortunately can't go out. I was diagnosed with COVID today, so I'm on quarantine for a bit. But I'll probably just be eating a bunch of candy and doing a cool makeup look.
Ain't nothing wrong with that. My first favorite holiday is Halloween. My second favorite holiday is the day after Halloween, when they walk the candy down at CVS.
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Washington, you the coolest man I know, but are you too cool to dress up?
Nah. So I just went to a Halloween birthday party a week ago, but I didn't have the means to like invest in the actual costume that I wanted. So I went in all black as Fred Hampton. But if I had the resources to do it and do it well, I would go as my favorite comic book character of all time. That's Wolverine.
All right, Wolverine. Good, good. Well, thank you all for indulging that. And I was going somewhere with that. So that leads me to my next point, which is about how do you take time to have a little bit of fun? I heard you mention, you know, professor, that you're going up for review. So like the academic life is rigorous, I'm sure, as in the activist life and student life, and over 20 years of activism myself, it took me a very, very long time to give myself permission to stop being in everything, stop having to speak on every panel. Every time somebody passes your mic, you gotta say something. That you gotta be everywhere, be everything to everybody. You have to give 10 assignments to your students, and I had to give myself permission to not do those things and remind myself like, yo, take a day off and pig out. Eat whatever you want to eat. Take a day off and sleep in late. Take a day off and log on to somebody's OnlyFans. Like whatever it is that you need to do to decompress and rejuvenate. So how do you do that, or what do you do? Or something, Dr. Washington, like for fun, or to make sure that you're not spending all your time at work being a professor. You look up one day, you're like old and miserable.
That's a great point, because I was actually my parents and my sister in particular have implored me for years to do that. And I'm grateful because not doing it before has had like really, really adverse implications on my physical and mental health. So I love to cook. I wouldn't call myself a gamer, but I love playing Madden. I love Madden. And recently, it may sound for some people problematic or counterintuitive, but I love going to the gun range. I love going to the range. It's costly, but I thoroughly enjoy going.
Awesome. I love that. Cool. I love to cook too. Terrified to shoot a gun, but a really wonderful book, Negroes with Guns. I'm a firm believer, but I'm just a little bit too chicken to do it. Tyler, listen, you helped me understand the notion of self-care, giving yourself permission, saying like, yo, I need a spa day. Since you're the white folk where y'all at, somebody help me pay for the spa day, right? To not be afraid to make requests of people and to use reparations, right, in a non-traditional sense. But like, yo, if you are a white person, a straight white person who's benefited from race privilege and gender privilege, like, and you got extra $20, put it on this massage, right? I've learned that from watching you, and I love how you model those type things. Please, Tyler, talk to us about your approach to self-care and knowing where to check out and knowing how to check in on other people who are also part of this work.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm gonna do is ask some white people to give me money that I deserve. I will not hesitate under any circumstance. They owe us. So I am like, give me the money. But on a serious note, no, that and something that I just cannot give up is putting on clothes. I mean, I will be in here till 3 o'clock in the morning on all the fashion sites, buying up all the clothes and putting together outfits. I will call a stylist to get my outfits together for a week. I love dressing up. And that's just one thing I cannot do. I had some people waiting on me today to take me to some places. And I said, they just gonna have to wait because I have to put my clothes on. It's just what it's gonna be. And then also every few days doing my makeup too. Those are the things that really bring me peace, right? Being able to, again, privilege, right? But being able to just sit in my dressing room and just sit with my clothes, put some stuff together, determining my mood. Ooh, if I put this together, throw a head on here, that just really makes me feel good. It's just really, it sparks my creativity. For my makeup, it really just brings my energy like down. Like if I'm feeling really tense, doing my makeup will help me because you just sitting there and you just painting your face and you just having a good time and you creating different shades and blending and stuff. It's just very soothing. So I do that, and I absolutely cannot go without watching TV. That's a non-negotiable. I don't care if we got some meetings, like that's what almost got me late here today, messing around with the TV. I just love my TV. I have to watch my shows, every single show. I'm caught up on them all. And I just love TV. So like I will not negotiate that with this movement. And also, I just told people, I was with a friend the other day and I was saying, I love this movement because I love working with and for and alongside my people, but this movement will not kill me. This movement will not send me to an early grave under any circumstance. because although I love this movement so much, I love me. And
that, that's a new approach, Tyler, because the old kind of thing we used to hang on to was like, something my dad tried, like this notion of the harder you work, the more you work yourself into an early grave, the more of a martyr you are, and it ain't cute. Like all of our best people is dead by the time they're 30. It don't have to be that way. I see you died in agreement, Professor. Like, like that used to be the approach that we had, like work yourself. Our show is tight. And it's like, no, stop, chill. We need you to fight another day.
Yeah, I want to travel the world. I want to see new things. I want to have a family. I want to do adventurous stuff. I want to, live. I want to live my life. I'm not getting ready to be, consumed in this trauma for the rest of my life. I gotta, I need to get out of that at some point and still recognize it's happening, but still take time to myself and to love on me and to love on the people who I love.
Absolutely. And another thing I also appreciated that you modeled really well when I would come to the Diversity at the Table in those early years was like, people can bring their kids. Like you would have this community meeting, right? People would be like, well, I don't have a child. I don't have bring your kids. And like, you just free love, free education, free food. Like every time we came to your meeting, you have food. And for a brother like me, I'm committed to the movement, but that was important to me, right? Like if I'm tired and I'm either gonna go home or go to your meeting, the fact that you had some free food for me, that's gonna help get me there. And you have no idea. I mean, I've been a broke college student. You have no idea what people are going through. And sometimes, this is something that I often encourage organizations I'm a part of, especially the white ones. They'd be like, let's have some hummus and some pine nuts. No, order a meat and 2 vegetables and some dessert. Because, why take you $1,000 budget to buy some pine nuts and some designer hummus, right? Because, that seems nice, and a couple bottles of wine. Well, there's going to be people coming to this meeting who've worked so hard today and they got money to feed themselves. So I always try to say, like, don't forget the fruit with the frilly. And even if you're a vegetarian, like order some meat and some potatoes, order something that people can take home, some extra pizza. I love that U of L does that. I love that organizations, well, they I know people get tired of pizza child, but like I've been there as a broke college student, like take this pizza home and you have no idea that fed me for 2 or 3 days, right? And so I think that's important. We'll talk about barriers and access. Like what are the ways in which we can use our access to power and resources and materials, especially those of us, like the professor or the 2 of you all, who get put in position of privilege, right, or who are afforded access to spaces because we are, y'all know what I'm talking about. We're magical Negroes, right? So we get to be in places we normally couldn't be in. Okay, so let me help redirect for this budget. Let me help redirect who you all are hiring for your keynote addresses. Let me help redirect what book we're picking for the book club this month. Like, what are the ways in which we can leverage our access to make what we have access to accessible to everybody else? Remi, I would definitely want to hear from you on the topic of that. Yeah. Remi, did you have thoughts? Or no? Are you okay? Remi, can you hear me?
I didn't hear the last part.
So I was just asking, I kind of before I got to throw it to you about self-care, how you take care of yourself, how you, I want to give you a chance to answer that question as well.
Oh, it's quite similar to what Tala described. I'm wondering if it's so similar because we're both Leos. But I love doing my makeup. I did my makeup today and it made me feel so much better. And I love finding a good outfit and spending time in my closet. Right now, well, not in the closet, but right now, what I'm doing for self-care is watching the Parkers. I love the show, but looking at the Parkers, it was like, wow, y'all was really fat phobic. I mean, I still get a good laugh, but it's like bittersweet now when I watch it. I'm still gonna finish all 6 seasons or whatever, how many seasons there are, but I'm watching the Parkers for my recreation right now.
And I think that any TV show from the 90s or early 2000s, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Moesha. They've been talking about America's Next Top Model. Chad, you couldn't tell me nothing bad about Tyra Banks 5-6 years ago, but none of those shows have aged well. I think that Martin has aged well because it was so irreverent that they like, you can watch it and still be funny. But like a lot of the shows that, like, Moesha and the Parkers, all those shows were hella fat phobic. Where some of them was extremely anti-gay. Every joke was anti-trans. So
Ever
yeah,
transphobic.
yeah, transphobic, yes. Transphobic. I've also come to a place where I'm able to like watch things like that and be able to enjoy the for their words, but then also make sure the important thing is be able to engage people who think it's just like regular humor to engage them like, wow, that's problematic, right? Because there are people who are laughing at those jokes because they think they're genuinely funny. Right? I'm laughing and I'm like, oh, that's so crude, right? But
Yeah.
I remember I watched like the claymation version of like I don't know the stop motion version of like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and like the stop motion of like Frosty the Snowman. I watched with Dr. Story one time. We were like, damn, these cartoons are like they were mean to Rudolph. Like I'm talking about like this is like some Adult Swim type shit like 20 years ago. But those stop motion Christmas things are were really kind of like that just did not age well. But yeah, let me see if we have any more questions. Yeah, so let's see. I have two more questions, and then we're gonna get back to Dr. Snyder for her to ask her last question. So Dr. Heineken wants to know. Dr. Story said yes, there was so mean to Rudolph. But no, we remember we were watching the doc and we were like, we gotta cut this off. This is like hurting my feelings. So Dr. Heineken asked, what are some things? And we kind of asked this earlier, but I want to hear specifically from you, Remi, and you, Talesha. Dr. Heineken asked, what are some specific things universities can do to better encourage and support student activists? Some better things they can do. I think about when I was student activists, like run some of that money, right? Like there's so many scholarships that are related to academics, and related to a GPA. And I speak for myself, child. That GPA wasn't all that cute because I was always like at a rally and at a march, and that didn't make me any less intelligent. But when all the criteria for all the scholarships were like a damn near perfect GPA, and very few of them gave credence to letters of recommendation or social or civic involvement. So I would say, help run some more dollars towards those people who are civically involved, regardless of academic. Well, no, of course you got to have an academic measure to some degree, but just understanding that those academic measures aren't universal. What do y'all think? And Professor, you too, if you have thoughts.
I think that one of the biggest things when it comes to student activists, I think that they can give them, for one, money and resources. That's the biggest thing. And then for the activists on the ground, or ones who used to be at U of L or still are there at U of L, but on the ground, I think it's about sharing those resources, right? I remember just recently I've been wanting to do a train the trainer or organize the organizer organize the organizer type of little training going on. And I'm thinking about all these books that I have to get that are really good, nice workbooks that can help guide me. And I'm like looking at the prices, and like $45 a book. And I'm like, how did the university get this book? And who do I need to talk to to see if they got some extra copies? I am wanting to, and I'm talking about me specifically, but I'm wanting to form a group of people to be on my action team. I want to really dive into what are the people's strengths on this action team. That Strength Quest book was really helpful for me when I was in college. I was able to take it like 3 times for free. And the book costs, like, to get the access code to take the test, costs like $35. Well, if I wanted to get that for 5 people, maybe you got a subscription somewhere or know something like that. And then also letting us in at the table, not just giving us the resources that you have, but letting us sit at the table where everyone is talking about funding, where everyone is talking about how to be more inclusive. I think sitting at the table is the best, because you get to talk for yourself, you get to tell your own story, and you get to be that live person who is getting the resource of the help.
I know from the sort of like academic perspective, there's a study, I can't recall if it was a year or 2 years ago, that that revealed that Black student activist work is perceived differently than white incoming student activism. Not to say that it's not encouraged, but it's not perceived as an asset in the same way that white student activism is. So taking a very critical look at who is vetting like applications and making sure that when Black students prioritize their activism and make it foundational to who they are as students, that the institution, and not just the institution, but departments and programs understand that and prioritize that. And to your point around those academic measures, we've taken measures in our department to eliminate the GRE score. as something that is taken into consideration when we're considering applications. So those are two things immediately that I think about that could have profound implications on Black student activists who are coming to the university.
Can you talk more about that? How many years has it been that you all stopped using that score, and have you seen any results in terms of larger applicants, or like what has been the results, or has not been long enough yet to know enough about?
Not long enough. The problem is that's a step in the right direction. And it's a recognition that those quantitative measures don't capture the vitality and brilliance of all students. The problem is if it doesn't come with some form of economic support, we're not going to see the sort of increase that we desperately need to see in teacher education and counselor education.
Remi, do you have any thoughts? The question was, I'm sorry, I had a brain fart on what the question was about. But yeah, so I'll give you any final thoughts you have. I'm sorry, what's your question?
I think one of my final thoughts, I don't know how the university would go about this, but one of my friends on Twitter who, we both go to U of O, and their tweet was, they were tweeting that, they were just flashbanged and tear gassed the night before, and then they had an economics exam that next day. And so it's like, how does the university protect its most vulnerable, especially their Black students during our current genocide? Honestly, it's so difficult, when, some of us are out here on the front lines or supporting other comrades who are on the ground or, in different type of roles while going to school, while taking tests. And it's like, I'm still recovering from, a flashbang and an episode of tear gas. How am I going to be able to perform well on this exam? So having more nuance and more flexibility for their students during this time.
Well, I tell you what, I have thoroughly, let's see, Dr. Snyder says you want to make her think of Malia Homer's speech that the anti-racist institution will not charge tuition. Okay, now don't open up that Pandora's box, Professor Snyder, because you're brand new right here. But if you want to abolish tuition, I'll be the first one to sign a petition. All right. But no, yes. Listen, all that to say, this conversation can go on for hours and days. Even Professor says, let's do it. So this is just the beginning of these conversations, listeners. As Dr. Snyder mentioned, they're going to do this 3 more times in the coming weeks. And so we really hope to continue to engage in the conversations and have all eyes on Louisville. But I want you all at home, in the chat rooms, when you put your fingers up and give us a sign language applause for our 3 wonderful panelists tonight, y'all. Ms. Remi Dior, Ms. Talesha Wilson, and Dr. Ahmad Washington. It's been a delight sharing this time with you all. Thank you all for your brilliance. Happy Cat Day, happy Halloween. Get well soon, Remi. And I'm gonna turn it back over to Dr. Snyder for some closing remarks. Or final question or whatever you like, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you so much. I really feel like your questions were so excellent and your answers were so excellent that I feel like we could just mic drop. But I do, for purposes of feminist reflexivity, and also because this panel is one in a series. And so one question I wanted to ask is, what did this panel do for all of you? How did it serve you and or the movement?
Well, yeah, I'll start. I'm sorry, are you asking us, Professor, or are you asking the attendees?
I'm asking you, panelists, and Jason, I certainly hope you respond to this question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, it is always good to do 2 particular things. One is to support WGST at U of L. Dr. Heineken is close to my heart, as is Dr. Terrio, as are all professors within the department who I've known since Dr. Story first came to U of L, and I've kind of been like the unofficial president of the Women's Gender Studies fan club ever since then. And they've been awfully kind and awfully good to me, as has the Pan African Studies department. So anytime I can personally help out, whether that means attending something or if you invite me to present or speak, I'm happy to do that. But then also to commune with my peoples, right? And I'm incredibly inspired by all the panelists tonight. I mean, Dr. Washington is doing such awesome stuff. Every time I get to see him in action, either at a community event, I never forget one time I went to a class he was teaching. I'm like, who is this man? Is brilliant. Like, so to see him in action. And of course, I get to see Tyler all the time. She's family, to see her in action and to commune with Remi, who has such brilliance as well. So I like that. All that shit feeds my soul. So like literally those things, like supporting the people who I care about, the institutions I care about. That's something that's become important to me as I figure out how my activism manifests differently. So as I mentioned, 20 years ago, I was an industry activist. I'm okay there. I can't be in the streets. My bones ache. So how do I continue to do important work in different ways? And for me, it looks like supporting institutions I love, like spending time with virtually people I care about and learn from. So those are what I've gotten from the panel tonight, and I appreciate the chance to have done that. Whoever wants to go next, please hop in.
I think for me, what I've gotten from the panel is that I always like to reflect on myself, and I feel like there's still so much work to do as far as the connections that I continue to build. Just recently, I've been talking about my trainings and who is in the space and who is not in the space, who has the ability to feel excluded from this space and why, and what can I do as the person who is training in this space to make everyone, all Black people, feel like this is a space for them. So I think that this has reminded me that even though I have all of these social constructs that in theory are supposed to keep me pushed back and keep me held back, that I still have so many privileges, and that could create barriers for connecting with other Black folk who look like me, or other queer folk, or LGBTQ folk who look like me, or other women who look like me. And I know that I have work to do in order to create more safety and less barriers to get the access to things that people should already have anyways.
Remi, what are you taking from this panel tonight? What have you gotten from this?
I think I would agree with you. I mean, it's just amazing to be in community with beautiful Black people, and especially now that I'm starting quarantine, it was amazing just to have a conversation amongst people while my impending solitude is around me. But I've just learned so much from the other panelists. I'm so excited that I was introduced to Dr. Washington. I don't really take classes too much in the education department, so we probably would have never crossed paths, but it was wonderful to hear that you are doing such wonderful work. And yeah.
I'm trying to change that because it is isolating. It feels isolating over in the College of Education, not because these aren't topics of conversation, it's the way that the problems are conceptualized that's just so radically different, right? You all talked about how these conversations aren't peripheral to how you understand yourselves as student and activists, and it very much feels like it exists on the periphery in the College of Education. So this is so inspiring. And Remi, I've never had the pleasure before, but this has been awesome. I thank you for your wisdom. And Tyler, I've had one or two opportunities, but the second that this is all over and we can finally move back into the classroom, I look forward to being able to reestablish that community. So for me, it's just the ability to engage with such depth and compassion and love and empathy with folks that I wouldn't normally have an opportunity to do so with.
Right on. Well, let me see. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Listen, can I take this audience, Professor Snyder, can I take this audience with me to every event I do? Because these people believe in feedback, and I really appreciate that, because as someone who MCs events an awful lot, and I believe in call and response and signifying child, ain't that the worst in a room full of crickets? And I'm like, I see you, Carrie, and Dr. Caldwell. I see you, everybody. I see y'all, and I appreciate y'all cheering us on. And I agree completely that our panelists did a wonderful job. And so I guess I'll see you all at the next event. Professor, take it away.
I don't know how anyone could be crickets anything around. You're so fantastic and skilled. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of you for sharing of your brilliance, of your expertise, It was such a pleasure and an honor. And I hope for the folks, and including the folks in the panel, I hope you can join us at our next session, which will be Imagining Our Way to Freedom, Art, Activism, and World Making. So thank you all so much. Have a great night. So grateful to you. Bye, everyone.